Okay. So welcome everybody. This is the third installment of the Western Lake Erie Basin Advisory Group's winter webinar series, updates from Michigan's Western Lake Erie Basin. This webinar series is designed to provide our community with updates about ongoing projects to manage nutrient pollution in Michigan's portion of the Western Lake Erie Basin. So my name is Allison Bressler, if you don't know me. I'm the program manager of the Western Lake Erie Basin Advisory Group. This is a community group that works collaboratively with Michigan's quality of life agencies to inform how the state implements projects aimed at managing and monitoring phosphorus to improve water quality in Lake Erie. And this webinar series is funded by the Herb Family Foundation, who funds all of our work in the Western Basin, and we're very grateful for their continued support of our work. So today we're welcoming Dr. Jennifer Blesh, who is an associate professor at the University of Michigan in the School for Environment and Sustainability. Dr. Blesh leads the Soil and Agroecosystems Lab that explores how different agricultural production systems affect ecological and social outcomes. Her current research seeks to advance knowledge about the relationship between conservation practices, soil health, and water quality. And today she's going to be talking about the new Healthy Soils, Healthy Waters program that MDARD is funding in the Western Basin. So I'm going to pass it off to Jennifer to share her screen. And also, as you're joining, you can post your affiliation and your interest in soil health in the chat. Thanks. All right, Jennifer.
Is the screen share working and can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Thanks so much for the intro, Allison, and for the invitation to share an update on our project today. And thanks to all of you for sitting in. I hope to keep this to about 20-ish minutes, thinking that maybe many of you are multitasking and eating lunch while listening. That might be a good time to eat lunch. And then I'd love to open things for discussion and hear feedback from all of you on the next phases and steps of this project. See if I can advance my slides here. Okay. So I want to briefly introduce the main project team listed here. This is a coordinated and on-farm research effort that represents a new partnership between scientists who are monitoring soil and agroecosystem health and those who are conducting water quality monitoring. So we have me, Brendan O'Neill, and Vincent Denef at U of M, Jeremiah Asher and Christine Sprunger at MSU. Funding from MDARD, and I think several folks who are funding this project are on the call, partnering with Michigan Agriculture Advancement and the conservation districts on both recruitment and outreach activities. Alliance for the Great Lakes, so we're coordinating also with the expanded watershed water quality monitoring project, also funded by MDARD. I think you'll hear from them in a webinar soon. And we're also partnering with the Michigan Climate Smart Farm Project, which is focused on specialty farms. So I want to just start by acknowledging that this is very much a team-based effort. And I also want to acknowledge the many research assistants who've collected data on this project so far. So I shared a couple of these ages ago at an advisory group meeting, but I'll just refresh your memory on the big picture of the project and then give an update of what we've done this season. The overall goal of this work is to partner with farmers in the Western Lake Erie Basin to improve our understanding of how soil health affects water quality, while also supporting increased adoption of regenerative practices on farms. So there's a lot of interest now in soil health, but the potential for that concept to really guide farm management hasn't been fully realized yet. And I think it's partly because it's challenging to rigorously assess soil health and to share those results in a way that's meaningful to farmers. We also still lack studies that are connecting soil health testing to outcomes that matter to growers and to the broader public. So a main hypothesis of this work is if we can strengthen understanding of the links between management and soil health, we can help meet water quality and other goals through the feedback loop that's shown here, that blue arrow. because growers experience soil health on a daily basis. They recognize its importance for productivity and also for resilience. So I'll briefly define what I mean by soil health. So we're talking about interactions among soil's biological, chemical, and physical properties that tell us about the ability of soil to provide different benefits. So this perspective definitely thinks about yield and productivity, but takes a much more holistic perspective to also consider a lot of other important functions, right? Like water infiltration and storage, pest control, cycling nutrients, building carbon, and many more. Soil organic matter is where carbon is stored in soil. It's a main energy source for biological activity. So a lot of useful soil health indicators are biological. In this study, we're including some novel indicators, including profiling the microbial community, as well as a focus on soil phosphorus fractions and mobilization in soil. And I'll say more about that in a minute. So for soil health testing to work, we really need to have a clear interpretation that's meaningful to management. And these tests need to be adapted to regional contexts, make sense for a given region's climate and soils. I'll also briefly define how we're defining regenerative practices for this project. I mentioned an overall goal is to try to support adoption of regenerative practices. So we're including data in this study from all practices, and that's important. We really want to capture a wide range of management so that we can understand these relationships between management and soil health. But we drew on our networks to identify and partner with growers who use regenerative practices, which are currently harder to find in the landscape. And so here we're adopting this common definition of practices that restore soil organic matter by maximizing living roots and fostering plant diversity or diversity through livestock integration. So key practices are reduced or no tillage, use of cover crops or perennials in rotation, integration of livestock, and reduced use of inputs. So in general, regenerative practices fall on the right-hand side of this continuum or spectrum that I'm showing here, but definitely recognize, this is a continuum. There's a lot of variation, and regenerative ag will look different on different types of farms and in different contexts. And I'll also just briefly say a reason for this emphasis is that these regenerative practices have known mechanisms that can increase important outcomes like water quality and resilience. So specifically, they build soil organic matter and the many functions that it provides in soil, and they support interactions, ecological processes and interactions between species that can help supply nutrients and reduce pest pressure, and therefore reduce the need for external inputs. So I'm going to shift now to summarizing the three main phases of this work to give a brief update of what we've done so far, and then I want to field questions and seek your input on our next steps. So our study site for phase 1 is Michigan's portion of the Western Lake Erie Basin. We mainly recruited participants from Lenawee, Hillsdale, and Monroe counties, with some fields in Washtenaw as well. So the first phase is this on-farm research to connect practices to soil health indicators and also to nitrogen and phosphorus balances. I'll explain that in a minute. But we basically sampled row crop fields in the Western Lake Erie Basin, plus the specialty crop fields or farms that are enrolled in the Michigan Climate Smart Farm Project, which is funded by the USDA Climate Smart Commodities Program. So we're identifying regionally appropriate soil health indicators that are sensitive to management, so that tell us about differences in management across farms, with a focus on indicators that are useful for giving information about buildup of soil organic matter and retention of nitrogen and phosphorus. So we sampled a lot of fields spanning a broad area in the basin. You can see the tally on the top left here, 60 row crop fields, 21 climate smart agriculture fields. So these were mainly specialty crops. And we also sampled 10 woodlots that were adjacent to cropped fields and on similar soil types, which will provide useful information about reference levels of soil health in unmanaged soils. We selected fields that had relatively stable management histories over the past 5 years so that we can link management practices to indicators. So let's say someone is just about to start cover cropping this season. Well, we wouldn't count that as a cover cropped field because it doesn't have that history. So we wanted to have some stability to be able to draw conclusions about how management drives soil health. And we typically sampled 2 fields per farm. So that means we had 41 farms in this phase of the study. And this is just an example picture here. Often farms picked fields that were side by side. In some cases, we had, fields in different areas. On the left here, you can see the soil sampling probe. So we collected a composite of at least 20 soil cores from up to 2 main soil types per field to a depth of 20 centimeters. Each core was marked using GPS in the Field Maps app, and we ended up with a total of 100 composite soil samples. In the middle, you can see the hammer core we used to measure bulk density. So that's the mass of soil, the weight of soil per volume. And we did that in 2 locations per field, so 200 samples total. And that will be used to convert our numbers to stocks, so like the total amount of carbon, nitrogen, or phosphorus in a field. It's also a useful indicator of physical soil health. And then on the right, you can see a penetrometer that we use to measure soil compaction. We did this at 40 locations per field, so just over 3,500 measurements. And we had a total of 20 researchers participate in the field work this fall. And my lab manager, Beth Van Duzen's on this call. She really made all of that run super smoothly. So what are we measuring? I won't, this is a complicated slide. I'm just going to give a high-level overview. But on the left, you can see there's a pretty long list of biological indicators of soil health. These tend to be sensitive to changes in management. They reflect processes that build soil carbon, retain and cycle nitrogen and phosphorus. So for example, we're separating soil organic matter into different components that provide different functions. We're understanding microbial community composition using genomic DNA, as well as function using enzyme activities, and also complexity of the broader soil food web, so nematodes. Of interest to the group in the middle, if you look at the typical chemical indicators, we've also added in a fractionation approach for soil phosphorus, so we can understand how much phosphorus is bound to minerals, how much is in different components of organic matter, which is important for understanding how phosphorus is mobilized and potentially lost from fields. And then on the right, you can see a set of physical indicators. These are useful, especially because they tend to respond pretty quickly to changes in management, and they're related to a lot of other important functions, especially resilience to extreme weather, right? So improved water infiltration and water storage. So the idea here is to have a really comprehensive picture of soil health across this wide range of fields. We're currently conducting interviews with all of the grower participants. We're about 2/3 of the way through the interviews, and we're collecting information about farm scale land use and long-term history. And then for the fields we sampled, a detailed 5-year crop history, including all nutrient inputs and nutrient management practices, yields, tillage types, number of passes, irrigation, tile drainage, also some environmental characteristics like slope and dominant soil type. And then to connect management to soil health and potential water quality outcomes, we're using these interviews to calculate a metric of nitrogen and phosphorus use efficiency. And so the approach we're using is shown here. This is called a partial nutrient balance. And we're calculating these from 2020 through 2024, which was the season we sampled, as the sum of all nitrogen and phosphorus inputs to the field on an annual basis. And then we subtract out nitrogen and phosphorus that are removed in harvested crops or livestock products. And so that metric indicates whether nitrogen and phosphorus are being added in deficit or in excess of crop demand. And we know from a long line of research that sustained nutrient surpluses correlate very strongly with losses to the environment. This is also a good economic indicator, so it can highlight potential for cost savings. And I think when we couple this with the soil health test, it will really inform where farmers can potentially reduce inputs. So we're, again, like I said, most of the way through these interviews, I can say we've successfully captured a wide range of management practices in the study. A lot of bare fields, cover cropped fields, as shown here. Many fields in cereal rye, some in cover crop mixtures, with practices including planting green. We have fields with a really long-term history of no-till, some with frequent tillage and irrigation, fields with a long-term history of perennial cover through, for example, CRP or CREP programs, alfalfa forage. We have some rotationally grazed fields with livestock, manure and compost inputs, fields with nitrogen and phosphorus management practices, including variable rate technology, side dressing, reduced application rates. So a nice range, and I'll show a couple more pictures. Here's a nice cover crop mixture with high fall biomass. Here's some soybean residue in a field where we also sampled an adjacent alfalfa field. You can see that sort of peeking out there in the corner. Again, we sampled 10 forest plots to understand more about reference levels of soil health for the region. So here's just some more woodlot pictures. These are some of the fields that are in the Climate Smart Farm program. And here's some examples of fields with winter cover, just to show sort of the range here. So this is a nice example of two neighboring farms on which we sampled 2 fields each, one in alfalfa and 3 that had rye. So rye following corn, rye following soy, and then a more sort of lush stand of rye on the top right there. So hopefully that helps to illustrate the management gradient, which will relate to soil health indicators, and then again to nitrogen and phosphorus use efficiency. So that's phase 1. And again, we've completed the soil sampling and we're working on the interviews. So I want to quickly share next steps, the other 2 phases, and then open things for discussion. So as we do these interviews, we're identifying growers who are interested in the second phase. And that involves, hopefully for a subset of about 25 fields, maintaining or implementing a new regenerative practice for the next 3 seasons. And we'll then sample again for the same set of soil health metrics. And that will really help us understand change over time within a field in response to management, again, across a range of different soil conditions. So for example, let's say somebody has been cover cropping for the past 2 years. An opportunity for phase 2 might be to take it up a level, maybe try a mixture or do something else to try to increase cover crop biomass, or maybe do it 2 or 3 years in a row, which can be tricky. So we're trying to just sort of, even for practices that have already been there, think about ways that we could sort of ramp up a little bit and see changes in soil health. Or we might, if there's a field that's been bare and tilled, think about no-till or think about trying a cover crop. So a lot of different examples, and we're currently working on lining this up. In addition to refining our understanding of which indicators are really most sensitive and best for our region, we also want to support adoption of new practices. And so I'm excited about this related project and funding source. I think these folks are on the call today. And you might have heard about this earlier, so I won't say much here, but we're just hoping that this Eagle SHIP project or program can really provide an additional incentive for some of our partners to think about continuing in the project. So we have a research incentive that goes with our work, but obviously doing something new in a field for 3 seasons is risky, requires some support, and this seems like a nice complement or opportunity for synergies to help us with recruitment in that phase. So we're mentioning this program in all of our interviews, encouraging folks to call their conservation districts. And I'd definitely be more interested in thinking more about synergies in the discussion, and also that the technical assistance piece, which may also be key. So the most involved piece is the third phase, and that's in collaboration with Michigan State University's Institute of Water Research. So we're leveraging this other MDARD-funded water monitoring project and partnering with folks who are already doing this work. And the idea is to understand how practices that improve soil health are related to nutrient conservation or loss. And partitioning of those losses in the case of phosphorus as soluble or particulate phosphorus at the edges of fields and then also downstream. So we'll measure nitrate and soluble and particulate phosphorus in subsurface drainage and then possibly also in runoff depending on each field's topography and drainage. So we're currently identifying sites for this phase 2 with the hope of installing the equipment that sometime this spring or by June. So a bit ambitious, but in progress. It's a bigger ask of folks. One of the priority subwatersheds is the Stony South Branch River Raisin. We're hoping for at least 2 fields there and then up to 4 fields that are elsewhere in our study region. So this will take some careful planning. We're working on that to think about how we select fields that have important contrasts that will provide useful case studies and that can then be used for model improvement and that will improve our ability to be able to predict water quality outcomes based on changes in soil health within fields. So building on our past work on farms, our goal here is really to take a participatory co-learning approach. We really want to blend researcher knowledge with farmer knowledge at all stages throughout this process. We'll be sharing data with participants regularly. We would like to hear feedback on those results, whether they're useful or meaningful, whether they influence management, for instance. We'll have a series of field days and roundtable discussions tailored to the different audiences included in this project. And then longer term, a main goal is to inform MDARD's conservation programs by improving our understanding of the outcomes of different practices and then sharing the feedback that we hear from growers and other ag professionals. So that's what I have to share. I'm guessing there will be some questions, but in case not, I just threw some discussion questions up here as well as prompts. I would love to hear more about how this project relates to systems that you're farming or advising on, any limitations or concerns you have, and then if you have other ideas for things that we could explore or consider exploring, that would be great as well. So thanks for your attention. I'll leave the slides up for now, but I might stop sharing if we're just having broader discussion. Thank you.
Jennifer. Okay, so for the discussion, you're welcome to put questions in the chat and I'll read them out for you. You can also raise your little virtual hand or just physically turn your camera on and raise your hand and I'll call on you. And yeah, in general, feel free to turn your video on and unmute yourself during this discussion. Okay, we already have some questions in the chat. So John Bratton asks, can you elaborate on how to generalize or scale up your results?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you mean to the basin or beyond. Our main goal is to generalize to the basin scale, although I think there are broader findings ecologically that will be important as well. So in the first phase, we're basically we can use statistical techniques to try to control for some of the messiness of the real world, differences in soil type and climate across the sites, and develop certain derived variables or indicators that tighten that management gradient. So for instance, we can have variables like a number for crop rotation diversity or complexity, or a quantitative variable for tillage intensity. So we'll develop a number of variables like that help to broaden across and allow us to test these relationships in a robust way. I think the trick here is that, as you all know, like farming is so site specific and context specific, and practices work differently in different soil types and conditions and histories. And so I think are ways we can really straddle that, being able to pull out some generalizable things like, okay, let's say you reach this level of soil health based on this indicator. We know a legume grass brassica mixture works well, right? That's sort of a broader versus like on a given farm with a given history. Here are some results specific to your farm. So we'll give individualized reports to all participants that have that really site-specific knowledge, but then we can also draw broader conclusions that can then be tailored a little bit to different settings. Hopefully that makes sense, but that's a great question.
Great. We got a thumbs up from John. Okay, so our next question is from Doug Jarling. And he asks about the edge of field monitoring. Are you also checking the loading upstream for benchmark?
Hopefully both up and downstream. I have less detail to share today on the water quality monitoring piece because that's in the earliest phase, but definitely we're excited that there's already a lot of monitoring happening and currently being set up in our study area. So I think, yes, well, that's part of the strategic selection of fields, is picking fields that are in locations that will enable us to do that, at least for a subset of them.
And if you'd like to learn more about the water quality monitoring efforts, our webinar next week is going to be covering that.
Oh, perfect. I'm
So
glad they're
stay
back to
tuned.
back. And I see Tom's on this call too, if he wants to jump in with anything.
No, I think you hit it, Jen. I mean, we're the number of sites that we have across those 5 priority subs. I think we'll be able to have a pretty good understanding of what's happening above most of the fields that you're pulling.
Great, thank you.
Great. Our next question is from Allegra. Are you considering herbicide and pesticide use in farm management as a factor impacting soil health?
And along with that, are you considering how farmers' nutrient management is impacting nutrient cycling and losses? The first part of your question is, the answer is sort of. The second part, definitely. So we really, we wrote this proposal and started this project very much through the lens of nutrient management and nutrient cycling. And hindsight is 2020. And as I'm doing these interviews, I'm wishing we had a stronger focus on full details on herbicide and pesticide use. And I think we will collect that for folks in phases 2 and 3. Just because so we don't have as many details in our question list on those practices because we were focused heavily on nutrient management. It's already asking a lot of farmers' time. And there are trade-offs there, but I'm realizing that because we're focused so heavily on the microbial community, nematodes, that could be a really important covariate to have in there, just some indicator of like intensity of herbicide and pesticide use. And of course, that's also a broader general finding that would be interesting to folks, right? To know, are people with certain practices able to back off of those costs and rates? So we're going to build that in a stronger way in phase 2. Great question. And we certainly have some information on it now. Like for folks with cover crops, for example, we're asking about termination method. We're definitely considering how nutrient management practices are affecting cycling and losses. So some of the soil health indicators tell us about internal cycling in the soil. And then the losses, we're doing that proxy measure, just nitrogen or phosphorus use efficiency, and we'll have the actual losses monitored for a smaller number of fields because that's so labor intensive and so expensive. So yeah, hopefully that answers that, Allegra.
All right, so our next question is from Subasis. How is this regenerative agriculture impacting water quality versus traditional conservation practices improving water quality? And do you see any differences between the two?
What do you mean by traditional conservation practices? Do you mind clarifying?
You are welcome to unmute yourself.
Do you mean like infield or edge of field or both?
Cover crop and buffer strip?
So I'm not sure if I fully understand. In some ways, like we're considering cover crops for sure as an example of a regenerative practice. buffer strips and other edge of field technologies are not our primary focus. We're collecting information on them, so we have questions about them in our guide, and we're interested in them. We view them as highly synergistic. But the main focus of this research is in-field practices, because those are the ones that are directly affecting in-field soil health. So for example, well, there are, I mean, certainly if you have something like controlled drainage on the edge of field, that might then be affecting the biological community and cycling in soil. So yes, we are linking those things and collecting information on all of them, but a main focus from the analysis end is that what's happening in the field. So hopefully that makes sense, but definitely view them as synergistic and are interested in those synergies.
Great. And then Thad's asking a question about edge of field water quality monitoring. Is it going to include monitoring surface runoff from the field or just subsurface tile drainage?
That would be a great question for Jeremiah, for our partner, but my understanding is that potentially it depends on the field. So if there's enough of a slope that we can capture it, yes. And if not, then we'll focus on subsurface. I think he's had experiences in the past where the surface can be really hard to capture. You might have one huge rain event that sort of overwhelms the equipment and makes interpretation tricky. So we're sort of seeing where we stand on that as we line fields up, but definitely subsurface and then surface if it makes sense.
And we should be able to provide an update on that topic at the Western Lake Erie Basin Conference in June, when we'll know more about what's planned for that. Okay, the next question is, what are the costs associated with the soil testing model that you're using for this program? And what does economic modeling look like for the program to determine monetary business implications for producers when changing management behaviors for soil health?
Great questions. I'm wondering if I might go back to see if I can click on this again. So if you look at this ugly chart here, one thing I maybe should have noted here is that we're using a little bit of a hybrid approach. So as researchers who work in soil science, we're not doing what's in just a commercial soil health test. So commercial soil health testing is designed basically for high throughput and to give indicators that correspond with something real, with some real property of soil. We're taking a bit of a hybrid approach here. So we're in some cases measuring real properties of soil, like particulate organic matter is a true measurable fraction of organic matter, whereas something like POXC is available in a commercial soil health test, and it's like more of a quick and dirty indicator, a chemical reagent that's used as a proxy for either active or stable fractions of organic matter. So the reason I say that is that our costs in doing this work aren't necessarily reflective of a commercial soil health test. I believe those can be around $100 a sample, but I haven't checked the numbers recently. Typically, if you send off to a soil health testing lab, you would get about 4 or 5 biological, chemical, and physical indicators, and then they'll score them on a 0 to 100 scale to give you a sense of whether your number is high or low for a given soil texture, like a very sandy versus a clayey soil. So this is not a commercial soil health test necessarily, although if folks are also doing that, we'll have some of the same indicators so that it can compare those directly. So I don't exactly know how to answer that. For us, it's quite expensive, but we also have the benefit of a university setting and a lot of students who are working away in the lab. So a little bit mixed on that question. And then we're not formally including economic modeling in these phases that I described here. I think that would be a really important piece to add, and is an important question for thinking about adoption. I will say you've probably noticed that like one question we sometimes get when sharing this is like, oh, well, isn't your sample biased, right? Because you sought out people who are who are using some of these more innovative practices. And that's absolutely true. Like we're trying to make sure we get a management gradient because that's fine for the way we've designed our research question. We can then understand how management relates to outcomes. But for an economic assessment, that would be a little bit more problematic, and we might want to think more carefully about, you know, a balanced sample of adopters, non-adopters of specific practices. So I feel like there's a lot of opportunities there for thinking more deeply about the economic piece, but we're not doing formal economic modeling. We are, those indicators of nitrogen and phosphorus use efficiency certainly inform fertilizer costs. So hopefully that answers that in part.
And John has a question about collaboration with Ohio. Is that happening?
Not formally, no. But we are aware of that work and we'll be sharing findings and experiences for sure.
Okay, and then we have another question about groundwater monitoring to explore water quality benefits to shallow aquifers. Don't think that's happening.
I don't think so, no.
Are there any more questions from the audience before we go to Jennifer's discussion questions? Okay. All right, so I do want to encourage you, maybe we can start with the first one. So those of you in the audience who are farming or advising farmers, how do you see this project relating to the systems you farm or advise on? And again, feel free to unmute yourself and speak or put your response in the chat, but we are looking for feedback from this group today.
Taking the opportunity to jot down some notes on these other great questions you all asked. I'm curious for folks who are here who are technicians, if that's if you feel like it's within your scope or would make sense to talk directly about building relationships, or like let's say we get some folks locked in for that second phase, if there's anyone here who's able to help be support on the ground in ways that me and my lab can't, as that's not our specialty.
Okay, John posts in the chat, these results will improve the mechanistic understanding of soil health as opposed to just arm waving that soil health investments improve yields and generally lower costs.
Yes, I agree. That's the goal. Thanks for that comment. Thank you, Allegra.
Allegra is a technician in the watersheds. We appreciate that.
Also mentioned that, yeah, relating to the kind of program assistance that can go alongside adding new practices for some of these farmers in the phase 2. Sorry, didn't realize that was down. Hopefully you could still hear me. I've sent out postcards to a whole bunch of people in our county to let them know about the new soil health investment program and to invite them to some information meetings. And I included on that mailing list, I think, all of the farmers in Lenawee County that you have enrolled in your project. I think Tom shared that with me. So hopefully we gave them another nudge from our side.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Megan, do you want to speak now?
Yeah, Just, I don't know if this gets to the actual input that you're seeking, Dr. Blesh, but I think when you spoke at the Washington County Conservation Field Day this past year, and when I've heard you speak on some other ways and some other events, the points that I found the most compelling, if I'm putting like my farmer hat on or how to facilitate discussion in the fields, the points I found most compelling have been like the business use case, which we know, that's what people are asking for, but also the timeline. Like one of your slides in one of your presentations was like, kind of how you start to actualize the return on investment as like an economic gain and the timeline leading up to that. I think having that available as like a really easy, accessible, like ready to go talking point for technicians would be super helpful. So you can be like, yes, this is a big investment from you, both, emotionally, mentally, physically, financially. And like, please don't get discouraged in year 2 or 3. Like, this is what the journey looks like. I think that's like something that we all could use in the field to say, like, don't throw in the towel at year 1 or 2. And then the other point I would make is that as we were interviewing or talking to farmers or trying to onboard them to our various programs, there's like there's an equipment shortage or an equipment need to make these conversions. And that's one of the things that Washtenaw County Conservation District talks about is like, how can we better support like an equipment sharing program at these bigger farm levels instead of just hand tools. But I think also that MDARD is considering like, how do we network, like-minded farms together to share this equipment. But those are 2 needs that I see like out in the field.
Thanks for those comments, really helpful. Definitely, and you also jogged my memory that another bit of useful information we've been able to give back to folks from previous work is like, quantifying the amount of nutrients scavenged and recycled in cover crops, for instance. So that also can directly translate into a dollar value. And certainly the timeline thing is key. And I think often, and I know, growers know this very well too, like typically things like weed pressure can respond more quickly to some of these changes versus like, let's say, nutrient cycling in soil, which might take 3 to 5 years. And that's more risky, right? Thinking about reducing those inputs. So by having that, we have some information on that transition process and how long it takes from previous work across soil gradients, but also that's a key piece of phase 2 and understanding change over time and just looking at, so with different practices, how quickly are we seeing responses, which indicators are best for telling us about that. So great comments. And then, yeah, I see there are a couple of other comments about profitability as well. And I agree, that's super important.
Yeah, thanks for the other comments in the chat.
Oh, I see Allegra had a question about phosphorus. So a short answer might be just that like soils with a lot of silt and clay just have a much greater capacity to absorb or tie up inorganic phosphorus in minerals, but probably also have better aggregation, maybe more organic matter, which provides mechanisms for holding on to phosphorus and potentially cycling it internally. In sandier soils, you would really depend more on organic matter to build up pools of phosphorus that can be turned over by microbes and sort of represent a slow release phosphorus fertilizer to crops. And then all of that is driven heavily by pH, although most farmers are regulating pH to be within a certain range. But yeah, there will be big differences. And then certainly with a lot like a sandy soil, more likely to see losses through the soil profile versus maybe a heavier soil might see more losses through surface runoff. Good questions.
Maybe, I don't know if this is too specific for like the whole group, but I'd be really interested if we could get any of the farmers that moving on to phase 2, any of them enrolled in our lower soil phosphorus threshold practice. Because yeah, I'm really interested in understanding how these different soil indicators, how
Mhm.
those can tell us where we can lower the phosphorus critical level,
Yep.
where that can work. Because as I'm trying to advise farmers on trying the practice.
Yep.
Like,
Yeah, I think there's a great opportunity here. I'm so glad you brought that up because I intended to mention it when I showed that slide, that to me, that's actually one of the, I'm really excited that you all have funding for that, because I think we will have a set of indicators that in our mind as researchers tell us a lot about internal phosphorus cycling, but that might not be enough. Like for someone who's putting their profitability down the line, you know, that still sounds too risky. If we're like, hey, for phase 2, you seem like a great candidate to just completely stop phosphorus inputs, you know, that could be a big risk. But I think it will give us really exciting data that can then be generalized and useful to inform conservation throughout the basin. So yeah, there's a cost share for a practice that's for certain thresholds of soil phosphorus, not using inputs. And so to me, that is a really exciting opportunity. And that's a piece that we're going to focus on in the edge of field water quality monitoring as well. So if we have some interesting comparisons of, say, either soil texture or long-term history, could we even split a field and have like half where we completely stop inputs for 3 years versus the other half business as usual, and be able to monitor that difference?
Yeah, John had one follow-up on the phosphorus thing with the paper that folks might be interested in.
Great, thank you.
If you want a copy of that paper, let me know and I can send it to you. Anyone on the call.
No, it's a good paper.
Okay, and then we also have some interest from Jennifer English in Defiance, Ohio. Okay.
Great,
I
thank
can
you
still
so
send
much.
you
I'll
paper.
make a note of that. I know we're nearing sort of the end of our time. So since I have the floor, I'm going to take advantage and show one more slide, and then maybe I'll stop sharing just for the purpose of discussion. But we have a different project that involves cover cropping. It's called the Great Lakes Cover Crops Project. And I think many of you know about this, but I just wanted to flash this up here to say that we're still enrolling participants. This is a citizen science study where participants are collecting data on their fields, so measuring heights and taking photos of cover crops right before terminating them in the spring. So the focus is overwintering cover crops throughout the whole Great Lakes watershed. And we've been doing, this is the 3rd year, we've have more than 250 fields enroll, and it's a way to identify the main drivers of cover crop performance across the basin. So I just wanted to make sure folks were aware of that opportunity as well. And if you work with cover croppers, or if you are a cover cropper, that you consider checking it out.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. I'll send out a link to sign up for that in the follow-up email from this.
Okay, perfect, thanks. I'm gonna stop sharing just so we can see each other.
We have, oh, it looks like the paper is open access and John shared a link, so that's nice. Yeah, more and more academic papers are open access now. For those of you looking for more research. Okay, and then Brittany would like to see how the results of this research can influence the MSU Tri-State nutrient recommendations.
Me too. I mean, one of the main focuses of my work is what we've been calling ecological nutrient management, which is certainly related to the nutrient recommendations, but thinks about the whole farm ecosystem and the bigger picture, like the nutrient balances I talked about, or other component, all of the reservoirs of nutrients in soil, organic and inorganic, so not just the quickly extractable, soluble ones. And the way those recommendations were developed is because they're extractants that, you know, are known to correlate really well with yield through years of testing and just regression relationships from factorial experiments. And I think we've learned that that optimizes yield, but not the full suite of functions that we'd like to get from agricultural systems. So the trick, I think, is figuring out how to incorporate some that more holistic picture without, you know, sacrificing livelihoods and profitability.